Bienvenidos a Diálogos. Hoy tenemos una emisión muy especial. Estoy con Todd Shackelford y realmente creo que no necesita presentación. Es uno de los psicólogos más importantes de la actualidad. La entrevista será en inglés, pero pueden acceder a los subtítulos. Diré esto justamente en inglés. I'm here with Todd Shackelford, one of the most renowned psychologists in the world. And he doesn't need a presentation, and we are in a hectic schedule now. But if you want to listen, I will actually read this in Spanish. You can just click on the closed captions and you will have it in Spanish or in English as you want. So, Todd, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Well, I'm fine. I'm fine. You know, we were talking about how the time can be crazy sometimes, and we are, yes, in a hectic schedule. But um, as an anthropologist, I'm really amazed with your work. There are some questions that that I want to make, and one of them is that well, basically it's a relationship that there is in anthropology and psychology, because if we analyze the California school led by Heinrich, Boyd, Richardson, and Tomasello, there is like an emphasis on the dual inheritance and culture evolution, like an analog between the social behavior and the gene behavior as well. How do you evaluate this framework?
Specifically, the gene culture coevolutionary framework.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise, but my understanding of the literature is that it's incredibly useful. It can be incredibly, it can produce new and interesting insights that a more standard sort of psychological analysis may not be able to produce. So I have always found the gene culture coevolutionary, empirical and theoretical work super interesting and very useful. I think it's real. I mean, I think it's incredibly useful. As a matter of fact, it's just an area that I have not spent a huge amount of time, in terms of my own research in. But I certainly appreciate it.
Okay, and considering well, the if if we do like a brief comparison, the Santa Barbara approach emphasizes like the creation of hypotheses about evolved psychological mechanisms. So, what criteria do you and your colleagues use to determine whether a trait or behavior is truly adaptive?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and you're probably going to get as many answers as different people that you
Okay, okay.
ask. But I mean, I think most evolutionary psychologists rely to some extent on George Williams' definition, which was published in 1966. His sort of suggestion, and it's a very vague one, but it's also very useful, and that is that you can identify an adaptation by the appearance of improbable design or improbable apparent design. When a mechanism appears to be extraordinarily, quote, well designed for solving some particular function, that's an indication that it may well represent an adaptation, that it may have been produced by natural selection over evolutionary time to solve some particular adaptive problem. So a lot of evolutionary psychologists will focus on what we call design features, specific elements or features of that particular trait that appear to be conducive to solving some particular adaptive problem. So, for example, the eye appears to be improbably well designed for vision. Now, it may be designed for something else, but it certainly appears to be improbably well designed for vision, for solving problems associated with, sensitivity to and incorporation of visual information. So I think the short answer is evidence of improbable design or apparent design.
Yes, and that leads me to another question, and I really want like a solving answer here because I'm dealing with this as a professional myself. Do you believe in a separation between nature and nurture, or Or do you believe that this is like an epistemological barrier to research?
I think it's generally a barrier. I think it's generally more confusing than enlightening. I think it depends on, I mean, there are circumstances in which it makes very good sense to talk about nature and nurture, I suppose, in terms of, like behavioral genetic research, where you're looking at, variation in a trait, and you can ask questions like what proportion of the variation, in a group of people on a particular trait is attributable to variation in genes, and that's heritability, and then what proportion is attributable to variation in environmentality. So there is a sense in which at the population level or at a group level, you could talk about nature in terms of heritability and nurture in terms of environmentality. But other than that, I think it's often more confusing than enlightening. So we know that, the production of any body part or psychological mechanism requires both genes and environments. Otherwise, I mean, genes are inert, just bits of code, and environments can't do anything if there are no genes on which to act. Oh, I lost you.
So yeah, it was my mic. But it is appropriate to talk about let's say as culture as a sub-product of biology in terms of how well the inheritance of genes, for example.
Absolutely. I think that culture, and that's a really good question. I mean, it's a really good point. I think that's another area where there's tremendous confusion. There's a sense in which, some researchers or, some scholars pit culture as some kind of antithesis to biology or genes. Whereas, from an evolutionary psychological perspective, culture in and of itself is produced by evolved psychological adaptations, which themselves are the product of genes interacting with environments. So culture is not something extra. Well, culture doesn't just reach down, from the sky or from a god. I mean, it requires it requires evolved psychological mechanisms to produce and evolved psychological mechanisms to process.
And I was thinking, basically, when you were talking about these adaptations, I mean, if we follow the Santa Barbara premises for just saying, but do you think that it's proper to say that this is by trial and error? Because I'm following here some anthropologists like Joseph Henrich, as I said before, and it makes sense if you think that that social behavior is about trial and error. If we think, for example, how do politics exist, how the state exists in a certain society, yes, it has this gene behavior of trial and error where individuals do not certainly know what they are doing, but they are imitating what they believe that is right. I don't know if you agree with that approach to human behavior.
Yes, I certainly think that there is plenty of scope for imitative, cultural phenomena, and trial and error cultural phenomena. But even there, I would suggest that it's not just utterly random trial and error. It's fairly focused. Focused in terms of what's likely to have been successful for our ancestors over our evolutionary history. I think it's also the case that to the extent that we can identify, trial and error phenomena, or imitative cultural phenomena, it's still useful to ask what are the design features of the underlying evolved adaptations, psychological adaptations that motivate us to be interested in, copying someone's behavior, or that motivate us to be interested in seeing what are the effects of that particular behavior and identifying when they're successful and therefore copying that behavior. So I think any discussion of culture demands a discussion of evolved psychology.
Well, yeah, for sure, and that it's well, it's like a battle of studying symptoms, like we can say, of classical or mainstream anthropology, sociology, and political science or history, and not studying causal mechanisms. For example, how monogamy works. we can say that it's like for saving resource resources, and why our Western culture is monogamy, or the trend goes that way. And we can say, yes, it's for saving resources, or maybe you have another answer.
Yes, I think. Well, maybe I'm not. I'm not sure if there's a question in there. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, like a point that I'm making, and a question. Is it's yeah, like I was reading about how our culture was or has a trend to be monogamy, and other
Yes.
just don't have it. Okay, so and the answer was, okay, it's just for saving resources, for a long-term mate, for social pressure, and that sort of thing. And that is a behavior that our ancestors have. So do you believe that that has to be integrated with anthropology, political sciences, and history, in terms of like a social research for why X is producing Y, and not just interpreting social phenomena as, well, anthropology, sociology, and the other disciplines are doing?
Okay. Yes. Thank you. Yes. I mean, I think it's. I guess you don't have to. I mean, you can study social phenomena without an evolutionary perspective, or without asking questions about the underlying psychology that's motivating that behavior. But I think when you do that, you're missing an interesting piece of the full puzzle. And I think an evolutionary perspective, particularly an evolutionary psychological perspective, helps to unpack what we're seeing at the sociological or the cultural or the political levels.
Okay, yeah. Now it's more clear for me. And okay, so digging in your work, in your 2007 paper, male mate retention behaviors vary with risk of partner infidelity and sperm competition, you show that men at higher risk of infidelity perform more mate retention tactics. So looking back, because it's like, uh, um, well, yes, 18 years ago. Looking back, what do you see as the main strengths and limitations of that design, and how would you improve it today if you see any limitation?
Oh, sure. I mean, there are always limitations. I mean, what you hope as a researcher is that whatever the limitations are, they aren't fatal limitations. I mean, I would say that those aren't, the limitations aren't fatal, but they're still significant and important. Yeah, I mean, I think that work, I'm not absolutely sure which paper you're referring to, but it's okay. I can still answer the question. I mean, we're asking questions about whether or not male mate retention varies as a function of perceived risk of sperm competition in that particular work. And so, what we find in general, I don't know exactly what we find in that particular paper, but what we often find is that men's mate retention behaviors vary as a function of the perceived risk of their partner's infidelity, which we're using as a proxy for the perceived risk of sperm competition, by which we mean the partner has basically collected the sperm from an alternative male, a different male. If she's been unfaithful, she's collected another male's sperm, and so the argument is that men who are at greater risk of sperm competition will engage in more frequent or more severe or more varied forms of mate retention behavior in an effort to thwart their partner's, uh, you know, uh, interest in infidelity or in collecting, the sperm from other males. And that's generally what we find. I mean, the effects aren't huge by any means. I mean, generally we find small effects, but we do find that it's not irrelevant. That, in other words, if you want to predict men's mate retention behavior, one piece of that puzzle is to ask them, get assessments from them about how likely they think how likely they think their partners are to be unfaithful. And again, we do find that men increase the amount of mate retention that they do, and the nature of the mate retention, it's more varied when they perceive greater risk of partner infidelity.
And there is a paper in 2009 that is it's not all about her men's mate value and mate retention. it's like a puzzle to say it, but is that you found that, well, you and your colleagues found that higher mate value use more benefit provisioning and fewer cost-inflicting retention behaviors. So
Yes.
how do you interpret the causal direction of that correlation? And what follow-up work would you test to that causality?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, I mean, the way we interpreted that, we predicted that men who assess that they have relatively higher mate value, well, actually, in that paper, I think what we did is we found that men with higher mate value engaged in more benefit provisioning behaviors. Is that what you're referring to, that particular paper?
Yeah, yeah.
And in which case, it was based on men's mate value rather than women's mate value, right? And we found that men's mate value, higher mate value in men, predicted more benefit provisioning mate retention behaviors. In other words, one of the ways there are a couple of different ways to retain a partner by men's and women's own self-reports. You can either, provision your partner with more benefits, with more good stuff to make the relationship something they want to stay in, or you can threaten or inflict costs in the event that they try to leave the relationship. And then they stay because they're scared, basically. I mean, that's sort of the argument for domestic violence. And what we find is that men with higher mate value engage in more benefit provisioning tactics. In other words, men who have the ability to shower their partners with resources, for example, or kindness and caring, or essentially a lot of this turns on men's acquisition of, or either current or future acquisition of resources. Men who can do it that way, which suggests that the use of physical force, the use of violence, these might be sort of lower in the hierarchy of tactics deployed to keep a partner. So if men don't have to use those tactics, then it suggests it appears that they do not use those tactics. But not all men have the ability to, bestow their partners with, resources and gifts. And it's those men who, the literature indicates that men who are lower in socioeconomic status, basically, they don't have anything to give their partners in terms of gifts and resources. And so those are the men who are more likely to resort to physical violence, to domestic violence, and to inflicting costs. That's not to say that, well, I'll just add that obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but that's not to say that men who have resources never are domestically violent. Of course they are. But statistically speaking, it's men who do not have resources. It's men with lower socioeconomic status who are far more likely to inflict domestic violence on their partners.
And like we can say that, and like going back to avoid the epistemological barrier, that this is not differentiation between nature and culture. No, this is biology and environment all together, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, basically, we're asking questions about, I suppose you could say, at a sociological, cultural level, you're looking at behaviors like, domestic violence, physical, force, and you're asking what might be going on psychologically, at a level of psychological mechanisms. And what we're proposing is that men have adaptations that take into account what do they have to offer. Do they have resources to offer? If they do, they deploy them. If they don't, they can't, and therefore are more likely to use physical violence.
Yeah, because basically what I want to state is, and I'm taking the bullet, but in Argentina and in Latin America, basically, there is like a taboo of talking about this because we are full of psychoanalysis, basically, mostly in Argentina or in others, or in other places. Again, this differentiation between nature and culture, nature and nurture. So basically, the evolutionary approach is considered to be deterministic and to avoid anything related with environment or social behavior, and that is so inaccurate. So how can you address to those critics, because this, yes, is a barrier to research for us as scientists, basically.
Yeah, there's no doubt it is. I mean, I think it's just a massive confusion. I mean, to think that to conclude that an evolutionary perspective, or for that matter, a sort of broadly speaking biological perspective, means that you're a determinist. I mean, one could just as easily make the case that a cultural perspective is deterministic. That it's if you're exposed to this particular set of cultural phenomena, well, then you are doomed to behave in these particular ways. I think what this confusion turns on is sort of an acceptance of a so-called blank slate perspective on psychology. The idea is that we're all born exactly the same, and we're blank slates into which culture pours its information, and that's just not the way the human mind is built or operates.
But it's politically correct.
Yes, but it's politically correct. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just there's nothing for it but to continue to publish data that suggests that a blank slate, that the mind is not a blank slate, that in fact it does include psychological adaptations. It's kind of weird to think that the brain would be the only organ that's not, built in a functional way by natural selection. It would be strange if it were only the brain and not the heart and liver and kidneys and every other part of the body that we know is functionally designed. We know the brain is functionally designed. I think it's just it's a misconception and misunderstanding on the part of researchers who aren't properly educated. Who are ignorant, and ignorance is no crime. Ignorance can be rectified. The very smart people who think that biological perspectives are deterministic or an evolutionary perspective is deterministic. But it remains for those of us who understand that that's not true to better educate our colleagues.
And that's that is well, it involves academic prestige and all of that, so it's really hard. But okay, so going forward, and there's something that really is like something that I question myself every single day, and since I don't know when, and your paper, your works basically helped me with this. But in your early classic, basically about the testing of couples of 19 retention tactics, you can say that you did a cross-cultural comparison. But what can you refine or add to or adapt to new categories of mate retention behaviors in terms of a cross-cultural comparison? For example, if you're analyzing a tribal society, can we expect some adaptations that we can find in a urban organization, for example?
Yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, I think there's no doubt that our mate retention inventory has a strongly Western bias, a strongly industrialized cultural bias. We actually haven't. I know that other research, for example, there's a recent paper that has adapted the mate retention inventory to the Japanese context, to an Asian context. And I think basically they find it useful there as well. But of course, that's also a highly industrialized culture. If we were to take this inventory, what I would do is, I'd have to go through each one of the items, but my guess is that maybe half of them would be strange and not appropriate if you were going to collect data on a hunter-gatherer culture, or a culture that was far less westernized. There are a lot of questions about rifling through a partner's personal mail, for example, or calling a partner to see where she is. If you don't have electricity or you don't have a mail system, to deliver mail, well, then that doesn't even make sense. I think what we can do is we can identify items that capture, the qualities of mate retention that are more closely linked to the evolved psychology. In other words, things like expressions of jealousy, accusations of infidelity, following a partner to see if she's where she's going. Following a partner to see if she's where she said she was going. Talking to other people about one's partner to find out what she's doing when you're not there. People certainly rely on friends, or who they expect to be friends and family members to aid them in the process of mate retention behaviors. We have another paper where we developed an instrument called a coalitional mate retention inventory. This is an assessment of mate retention behaviors that rely on other people. So my brother, my uncle, my sister, to keep track of what my partner's doing. And people are self-reportedly do this. And that's the kind of thing you could ask in a culture that doesn't have, for example, electricity, or, it turns on social relationships, which are very similar and similarly organized, all over the world.
Yeah. So basically, like so briefly, it is like to gather the essential properties of phenomena and then try to do a cross-cultural comparison, basically.
Yes, if I was interested in doing cross-cultural comparison, and I think those are incredibly useful, I would probably want to develop a new inventory that basically wasn't as as westernized or as industrialized as the current inventory that we use, the mate retention inventory, which was developed in a Western culture and has been used mostly, exclusively actually, in Western cultures, as best I know.
And when you're working with a large N, what are the biggest issues that you find? Basically, that issues with correlations and that is not working, that or hypothesis that you have to remove, or maybe something that we can say some ethical work as well. What are the main challenges when there is a large N that covers, well, in this case, yes, Western culture, but if you have to make that broader and yes, more wider, what would you think that will be the main issues with a large N in a cross-cultural comparison?
Well, I guess I'm not understanding, because you would want to have a large N. You'd want to have a larger N. You'd want to have more cultures involved.
Yes.
Yeah. I guess I'm not sure problems as compared to if you had a smaller N, or I'm sorry, I don't understand.
When you're analyzing a large N,
Yes.
what are the main issues that you found over the years, and if we can translate that into a cross-cultural comparison, what would you imagine that the issues will be?
Do you mean a large N like the sample size, or a large N like the number of cultures involved in the project?
The sample size, yeah.
Well, the greatest risk when you have large N studies is that you overinterpret the results. So you might have, a correlation of 0.1, but if you have, several thousand participants, well, then that's going to be highly statistically significant. So, you always have to be wary of, overinterpreting very small effects, particularly when you have a large N. And I think the other issue is that this is correlational data. We're basically looking at the relationship between observed phenomena, between men's mate retention and, suspicions of infidelity. We don't know, and we can't say whether or not men's mate retention is, variation in mate retention is caused by suspicions in infidelity. That's the underlying theoretical argument, is that it is causal. But the truth is, when you're dealing with correlational data, whether it's cross-cultural data or single culture data, one has to respect the fact that, correlation cannot be used to, generally speaking, can't give you anything definitive about the causal relationships. So what you'd want to do is follow up with experimental work. If you find there's a correlation between men's suspicions of their partner's infidelity and men's mate retention behaviors, well, you'd want to devise some sort of, experimental design where you could, increase suspicions of infidelity and see whether or not that then subsequently increased men's mate retention behavior. And they're actually, those have ethical are ethical concerns in doing that, but there are ways to get at that. We've done some work where we've asked men to imagine that they are suspicious of a partner's infidelity, and and then subsequently assess whether or not they imagine increasing their mate retention behavior. Now, that has limitations because it's imagined, but this is just the game. The game is to continually try to address the limitations of the research and get a little bit closer to what might be true about human psychology and behavior.
And do you think that when you're working with a large sample, it turns to be highly probabilistic than causal? Because maybe what you gain in a for example, in a single case, it's going to be X is explaining Y. Okay, but if you make that bigger, well, it's kind of, again, it's correlation, a strong correlation, yes, but it could be more probabilistic. I don't know if you agree with that.
I'm trying to, I'm sorry, I don't quite understand if that's a question, or I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, the question is, do you believe that when the n is larger, when the sample is larger, it becomes more of a probabilistic issue than a causal relation if it were comparison with a single case, for example?
I mean, I guess if I understand you correctly, I mean, to the extent that you have more data rather than less data, you have a firmer, sense of what's actually true. And that would be the case, whether you're doing cross-cultural data, cross-cultural analyses, or analyses of a single culture. I mean, generally speaking, more data is better insofar as it allows you to, cast a wider net across the relevant populations. So I don't, I would say you're at greater risk if you just have a single sample or a case study. You're at much greater risk because it could be something peculiar about that particular case. But if you can find something in a large group of people, and not just in one culture, but perhaps if you can find it in multiple cultures, a particular relationship, I mean, it doesn't prove anything, but it gives you a little more certainty that you've identified something, at the level of psychological adaptation. I mean, there's a lot more work to do, but it gives you, some sense that things aren't dramatically different in a different culture, for example. Or, I mean, if you find something across 50 cultures, that gives you a little bit more confidence that you're identifying something about human nature than if you find something in just one culture or three cultures.
And do you believe that there are strict differences between anthropology, sociology, political science, and psychology in 2025? Because we're not talking about Durkheim or whoever in the 19th century. No, we're talking 2025. And I'm speaking for myself. I see blurred limits, but I don't know, what do you see? If they are working together, or there are no differences, or what?
Yeah, I think there seem to still be differences of emphasis. I mean, I'll say that, as an undergraduate, I took as many anthropology, biology, and psychology classes. I mean, when I was introduced to the field of evolutionary psychology, it was psychology, but it was equally anthropology and biology. And so, I've always thought in terms of multiple disciplines. I don't think of evolutionary psychology as a discipline. I think of it as a perspective, an interdisciplinary perspective on human nature, or on nature, on, what makes organisms tick. So I guess I'd answer that in two ways. One is, how do most people see those disciplines? Probably most people, probably even most evolutionary psychologists, see them as very different. That they're taking different perspectives. But I just don't see that. In order to do, high quality evolutionary psychological work, one has to be familiar with the relevant anthropology, biology, and psychology. And if you're doing work that's focused in violence or homicide, for example, which is a lot of our work, I think it also requires that you become familiar with the research in criminology and in sociology.
And I don't know if you're familiar with Clifford Geertz. Maybe yes or not.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What do you think of his interpretive approach?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that he basically focuses on culture as culture and social social norms and as as causal, and sort of skips the level of psychology, and that's I I think it's wrong. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly useful to be totally focused on what's happening at the level of culture and social life to the exclusion of what's happening at the level of psychological machinery of mind.
Well, yes, and I agree. And you were talking about suicide, basically, and yes, and crime and violence. Um, what do you think with something as old as Emil Durkheim address on suicide and your work basically on suicide? Do you think that there are some of these like social facts that are over us, or do you believe that other mechanisms explain better how suicide works?
Yeah, I think like any phenomena, I mean, in the case of suicide, I think we do want to ask questions about the underlying psychological machinery. I mean, those are the questions that I'm most interested in. But I also think it's important to be, sensitive to the larger cultural norms and expectations. I think I mean, I don't want to argue that suicide or any phenomenon can be explained entirely without reference to, cultural phenomena. I mean, we know that, when suicides happen, that can, suicide, particularly of a celebrity, can often be followed by an uptick in suicides by non-celebrities, and often using the same method that celebrity used. And that suggests that the mind is built to take into account what's happening around the person. So in that sense, I think it's as valuable for suicide as it is for any other phenomenon to consider and to take into account, the level of analysis that's focused at cultural phenomena. But again, I don't think cultural phenomena are somehow divorced from psychological machinery of mind. I think culture is produced by psychology, and culture is consumed by individuals with an evolved psychology. And so, to say something is cultural, demands a further explanation about what are the design features of the underlying psychology that motivates people to be interested in those cultural phenomena.
Yes, but what I was saying is that following the Latin American programs on study on sociology, and most of the Anglo world, I know some universities, most of them from Great Britain, but if they take on Durkheim the literal strict focus that he had in 1890 or the early 20th century. So my take is that is if you consider that social fact, he's saying that some norms when there is a Catholic society, there will be like a tendency to not commit suicide. If that program, if that approach should be thought today, or it should be reshaped. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think, there's much to, I mean, I wouldn't say either take or leave, Durkheim. I mean, there's much that he, wrote about, and many of his ideas and his arguments were very interesting and are useful. I mean, to the extent that it is the case, I don't know that it's the case, but let's imagine that it's the case that people in Catholic cultures are less likely to commit suicide. Well, then that suggests, precisely what we're talking about, that it is important to keep in mind, the relevant cultural, landscape. What I don't think is useful that Durkheim seems to have been, a proponent of is the argument that it's irrelevant, that individual psychology is irrelevant, that what's important, if you want to explain anything, then you go to the level of the culture or the society. And I think that is guaranteed to miss important information about why humans do what they do and when they do it.
And well, for like having a close to this great talk, because I know you're very busy, and I'm really grateful for your time. But I would really like an evaluation of a turning point in anthropology, and I believe that it touches psychology in a way, but in a analytic way. It was Levi-Strauss' take on the taboo of incest. He says something like it's like a social thing, because when there are scarce resources, in this case women, we as society tend to look out for partners in different tribes, in this sense. To prevent the endogenous reproduction, we basically make our society larger, finding new couples, and that is why incest is a prohibition. Do you agree with this classic assessment in the structures of basically on the structural take of Claude Levi-Strauss?
Well, I mean, I think what's missing, though, from that is an understanding of the evolved psychology of incest avoidance. I mean, you'd want to look at, I mean, I would want to look at, what are the design features of the proposed adaptations that motivate people to avoid incest. So I don't think it's it's not a competitor explanation. It just helps to unpack, what's going on psychologically. I mean, one argument, the argument that you just presented is that it matters, the relevant, the extent to which prospective mates are available. I mean, that you may find that when, I mean, I guess, the argument is that that incest will be, the taboo will be more extreme, I suppose, when there are fewer mates available, when you have to basically encourage people not to mate with relatives, for example. But that's implying something about the design of the underlying machinery of mind, that people are sensitive to this kind of information, mate availability, nearest, what is the local mating pool, and it suggests that under certain circumstances, certain sociological, cultural circumstances, that, the incest taboo, the interest in, the motivation to avoid incest may tick up or it may tick down, depending on the local, the local cultural environment, the local mating pool. So I don't think that there's necessarily they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, the other thing I always think about is whatever you're using to explain human incest avoidance, you have to also keep in mind that humans are just one of thousands of species that avoid incest. And, if you're going to, perhaps you want to argue that the explanation for human incest avoidance is at a cultural level. Okay, that's fine, I suppose, for the moment, but then are you therefore also going to argue the same thing with respect to birds and chimpanzees and bonobos and horses? And I mean, then it requires a little more thought. I mean, are you really going to make that argument for, incest avoidance in dogs? And if not, why not?
Okay. Well, that was a really good question, and well, it got me thinking. But uh, like but I was having a thought. I was thinking in something else, like to having a close. But why do you think that there is a taboo on evolutionary psychology and this thing that we call, and we agree that there is an interdisciplinary machine framework that works with anthropology, sociology, politics, and you cannot separate that from psychology. Do you think that there is a taboo? Do you think why is this not normalized in when you're doing a major or when you're simply studying at high school? Why is this something about political correctness? Is it ignorance? What is?
Well, I think political correctness as well as ignorance, and I think it's, it seems to be driven by, wishful thinking. I think people want it to be true. They want desperately for, anything to be possible. That, and that requires a blank slate. The idea that there's nothing there when we're born, and if only we could get it right, if only we could teach our children properly, well then, then there'll be no more violence and no more aggression and no more raping. And I think it's largely wishful thinking. It is true that that remains a taboo. Now, I don't know, that might be too strong. Maybe it's my own experience in the field, but it's much less controversial than it was today than it was, say, when I started 30 years ago, when it was super controversial to apply an evolutionary perspective to humans. But of course, there are still people who think, that if you're arguing an evolutionary perspective, then therefore you're saying that there's no role for social or cultural phenomena, which is just not true. There are cultural evolutionary psychologists, and there are evolutionary sociologists. So there are fields emerging that bring together the so-called biological fields with the so-called cultural fields. And I think that's something different today. And that's progress. So, I think it'll become more and more difficult to, just, bang your hand and say, well, you don't agree with this determinism. That's, the data are the data. The data suggests that we, like every other species on the planet, are the product of evolution by natural selection, and that, we behave in ways that, caused our ancestors to be relatively more successful at surviving and reproducing. And, you just have to get with the program.
Thank you very much, Todd. I'm very grateful for this. Thank you for actually recognizing Diálogos, our podcast, to be a place for you to speak, because I honestly think that in Argentina and Latin America, we need voices like you. Because, yes, and I have to speak for my experience, there is a taboo and there is ignorance.
Yeah.
So we have to fight it. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Okay, I hope you have a great day. This was another Diálogos podcast. And, ok, esto fue otra emisión de Diálogos podcast. Soy Facundo Guadagno y nos vemos muy